Welcome to the Massey Dialogue on Affordable Housing, Lessons from Regent Park. My name is Drew Kaufman. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Queen's University and an alumni of Massey College. These days, I write about issues of sovereign debt and country's debt, but I have a long history of working in affordable housing in Winnipeg and working with people experiencing homelessness in the prairies. Now, Massey College is built on land where many Indigenous peoples have lived. It's on the treaty lands and the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, as well as the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee peoples. Acknowledging this land is essential as we discuss issues of housing affordability. The concept of property rights, integral to our conversation, has roots in Canada's formation, where rights were granted to settlers at the exclusion of Indigenous nations from their jurisdictions. And this is the wider context necessary for thinking about our conversation today. And now, with this backdrop in mind, housing remains a critical challenge across Canada, particularly in urban centres like Toronto. According to the CMHC, Canada needs to build 5.8 million homes by 2030 to reach affordability. The average Canadian rent price hit $2,178 in October, a new high for the sixth consecutive month. Within this context, the Toronto Community Housing waitlist continues to grow. More than 100,000 people have applied to live in social housing in Toronto. And now winter is coming. Through the fall, there were still on average about 350 people living in tents each night in Toronto. And so today, we're talking about housing affordability. We're here to talk about what can be done to keep the central parts of a city diverse, viable, and affordable. And we're here to talk about how housing affordability can become a reality for our housing system. Now, the renovation of Regent Park, Toronto's oldest and largest social housing community, raises some possibilities and questions around two central ideas: public-private partnerships and mixed income communities. For almost 20 years, private developers have been working in partnership with the Toronto Community Housing to transform this 60-year-old underfunded social housing community into a mixed income neighborhood without displacing the original inhabitants. Some commentators have suggested that the financing of this revitalization, that the community benefit arrangements, and that this sort of inclusive project design can become a model for other projects around Toronto and Canada. But there's other critical researchers and residents who discuss how this once viable community was targeted for revitalization because of who lived there, and how this may have compromised a functional community. And so today is our first of two sessions on affordable housing in Toronto. Today, we're learning from the experiences of developers in producing housing. The second session on January 24th will focus on residents' experiences of this project. Now, we have four speakers with us today. Our first is Bob Johnson. Bob is a Massey College Senior Fellow and a Professor Emeritus with the Department of History at the University of Toronto. He is the co-author, alongside his wife, Laura Johnson, of Regent Park Redux, Reinventing Public Housing in Canada, and he's a longtime resident of Cabbagetown. The next panelist to my left is Bryan Sherwood. Bryan is the Director of Development Planning at Tridel, bringing over 13 years of expertise in residential development and urban planning, including significant work in affordable home ownership and community engagement. He also contributes to the broader community as a board member of both the Black Planners and Urbanists Association and Building Up, supporting Black professionals in urban planning and providing employment opportunities for people facing barriers to employment. The next panelist to my left is Heela Omarkhail. Heela is the Vice President of Social Impact at the Daniels Corporation, a leading GTA-based developer. She works to integrate social, cultural, and economic infrastructures into new community developments. And since 2009, Heela has been working on the revitalization of Regent Park in Toronto's downtown east. Heela, at the same time, also serves on the boards of several not-for-profits and various councils and committees. Lastly, we have Armine Yalnizyan joining us online. Armine is a leading economist and Massey College Senior Fellow. known for her role as the Atkinson Fellow on the Future of Workers and as a columnist at the Toronto Star. She has significant experience in Canadian economic policy, including working with the federal government and also in leadership positions with organizations like the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and the Canadian Association for Business Economics. At the same time, by heading initiatives on gender equality and economic inequality. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. And so to begin, I would like to bring Bob Johnson up to the stage to give us a bit of an overview of the history of Regent Park and the revitalization efforts there. And after that, we will turn to a larger discussion.
Thanks, Drew. For those who aren't familiar with it, Regent Park is situated in east central Toronto. It's a 67, 69 acre site, which as a social housing community has provided housing for something over 2,000 families for more than 60 years. It was built in the 1950s under the planning assumptions that were prevalent then. It had a brief period of what I call honeymoon through the 1960s when everything seemed to be going well. And in most people's eyes from that point onward, it went downhill. The issue was that the various administrative bodies that were operating the facility never had enough money to repair and enhance. And the community itself developed a series of pathologies that were quite problematic. There were drug gangs and a high rate of crime. In the eyes of critics, Regent Park was a ghetto of poverty, became a ghetto of poverty, because originally it was supposed to be a mixed rent geared to income community of middle as well as low income people. By the 1970s, it was not that any longer. And one of the results of that was that the revenues that were coming from rent were less and less capable of covering the costs of sustaining and repairing this very large physical plant. And so the problem became even worse at the turn of the millennium, when the Mike Harris government turned responsibility over to municipalities for housing. And the newly created Toronto Community Housing Association found itself in a position where it simply had no money to renovate, much less to replace, much less to enhance the provision of social housing. And at this point, the leadership of TCH embarked upon what I sometimes call an experiment. I've been corrected for this because if you use the word experiment, it makes it seem as though the people living there are guinea pigs, which is a very demeaning way of regarding them. It is, however, an important innovation on a number of different fronts. The first of them was the financing. If you couldn't find the money from the city budget, if the province was washing its hands, what could you possibly do? And this is where public-private partnership came in. If you could increase the density of settlement on those 69 acres and put up some market-level buildings, the profits from that would help to pay for the renovation or replacement of the existing subsidized buildings. So that was the first premise. But the planners in 2001, 2002, 2003 recognized that there were a series of other problems that needed to be addressed, and the most important of them was the viability of the community. To the outside critics, this was a terrible place, but to the people who lived there, it was home, and a very strong and vibrant home at that. And so the first stage of planning was a community consultation that was more than the usual going through the motions that public agencies are tending to do. Over 1,000 people took part in focus groups and a process of conversation that lasted for almost 2 years to try to figure out what should be done next. One subject on which they all agreed was that the existing buildings were not viable. When they were asked what should be saved, the answer was usually nothing. The buildings had deteriorated so much that the cost of replacing them would have been greater, the cost of repairing them would have been greater than the cost of replacing them. There were some other ideas that came out of that and some other ideas that came from planners that might or might not come into our discussion today. One of them was that you had to build a community infrastructure which included recreation facilities, it included shops. The old Regent Park was built as a mono community with virtually nothing but residences in it. Now the idea was that you would build a range of stuff that would make it pleasant and easy for people to live there, not just the people who were previously living there, but the new inhabitants who would come in. So that in the very early stages, the first supermarket opened, the first drugstore, the first Tim Hortons, and subsequently you had the development of athletic facilities, you had a fantastic swimming pool that was built. This was part of the whole process. Beyond this, I think, was the idea that people of different economic strengths would be able to live together in a comfortable fashion. There was the crucial figure, however, for the residents who were there before was a two-sided promise. In the first place, that there would be a one-for-one replacement of all of the residential units that were there before. And secondly, and this distinguishes Toronto from almost every other jurisdiction in North America that I'm aware of, that the residents would have a 100% ironclad right of return. If you look at what was done in places like Chicago, when massive developments of this sort were attempted, the number of original residents who remained on the site by the time the process was over was under 20%, and in many cases under 10. In the first 3 stages of Regent Park, which is what Laura and I wrote about, the rate was over 60%. And in the later parts of those stages, it was up to 80%. So in terms of community sustainability, something was going on that was different from other places. What that means is still to be determined, because alongside those people who are coming back, you have an even greater number of people who were moving into market level residences, either as owner occupants or as renters from absentee landlords. And whether those two populations can really learn from each other, share in the community, is still a question that remains. I think I've talked too much. I will stop there and leave it to the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. And with that, let's move on to a bit more of a discussion here. So my first question is for you, Bryan. So I know you're not speaking on behalf of Tridel, but
that's what I told them.
That's what you told them. And so, you know, Tridel is involved in other projects throughout Toronto, like Alexandra Park, just south of Kensington. And these projects are expanding. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts and the lessons learned from Regent Park and this model to revitalization.
Yeah, I think Bob spoke very eloquently about a lot of the key things that we as an industry have drawn from revitalization. One thing that, from my experience, one thing that I was able to pick up as a key differentiator from building of just affordable housing and supporting revitalization and trying to scale the city's ability to prepare housing is that, unlike the renewal projects that happened in the 50s and 60s, specifically in Regent Park, but also in Alexandra Park and some other communities across Toronto, that this housing wasn't temporary housing. I think the initial design and focus of providing renewal housing was to create spaces for people to live, to come out of slum housing and move into a transitional home where they could pay rent based on their income and then get a great job. And then once they've received a great job, they'd be able to get into the marketplace, and there's a comfortable set of housing for people in the middle, in middle wage brackets. That was the intention, and that was kind of the process for providing social housing. But what I've come to learn working both in Regent Park and Alex Park and some other communities that are being revitalized is that these homes are no longer transitional homes. These are, in a lot of cases, permanent homes. There are a lot of families that Heela and I work with regularly that have lived in Toronto community housing for generations. I can think of a specific family where the grandmother first entered into Toronto community housing prior to a revitalization in Alexandra Park. And then once her slum house was demolished and she was able to move into a new home in Alexandra Park, she stayed there and raised her daughter, and then her daughter had another daughter, and all three generations now live in social housing. So that forced the city to change how we implement and provide this type of housing. And the revitalization is about more than just bricks and mortar. It can't just provide homes, we need to provide communities. And one thing that I've seen, and a lesson that we can draw from in Regent Park and the work that Daniels has done in the time that they've been there, and what we kind of inspired to do, is to continue the work of building a community and not just providing a place for people to sleep.
Right. Thank you. And so Heela, I know this similar approach to community building is something that Daniels has pushed. Now working in the Golden Mile in Scarborough, I know Daniels has a big project there. Thinking through sort of the lessons you've learned from your experiences in Regent Park, what do you see sticking out when it comes to financing, community benefits, or other elements?
I mean, one of the key things I'd like to highlight, and sort of Bryan touched on it in the Regent Park example, was community leadership. One of the sort of key features of the revitalization of Regent Park is the conversation started as early as the 1970s, where community residents started to realize, a neighborhood that was all government housing with very little commercial, isolated from the rest of the city, was not quote unquote normal. And so, those consultations started very early on, where the community even lobbied different levels of government for a community center, and built that capacity within residents to the early 1990s, where they were, I think there was a Regent Park redevelopment network of residents that worked with planners and city leaders to start to conceptualize what a redevelopment of the neighborhood could look like, initially for sort of the northeast quadrant. And there was a little bit of momentum, and it fell apart. And it really, what it took was Toronto community housing and that social housing portfolio in Toronto being amalgamated in the early 2000s for the new leadership, as Bob said, at Toronto Community Housing, to look at this and say, okay, how do we address a repair backlog? One of the key features of Regent Park and Alex Park that's worth highlighting: location, location, location. You're 10 minutes east or 10 minutes west of the downtown core in either of those examples. And then you had, frankly, a community that had already been talking about revitalization. And so while there was quite a bit of trepidation that went along with that, it was really important to harness those community voices and really treat this as a bottom-up approach and not a top-down that was being imposed onto the residents. And so that's something we've certainly taken away at Daniels, is how do we, when we work in neighborhoods across the Greater Toronto area, really spend time in neighborhoods listening, learning. We've quoted internally what we call listen and learn tours, where we actually, my team will spend time in each neighborhood, meeting with residents, meeting with business owners, any sort of associations, not-for-profits that exist, and listen to their hopes, dreams, fears about development coming to their communities, with the fundamental premise that if we do this with intentionality, development just doesn't have to be good for the developer, but it can be good for everyone in a community. And that's really the approach. The other lesson I'll highlight is really partnership. That is at the heart of the Regent Park revitalization. And, as with all good relationships, it is complicated, it is challenging, but it is so worth it. Because looking at the Regent Park example, the public sector, the city and Toronto Community Housing, couldn't have gone it alone. And a private developer would not have been able to bring some of the relationship sensibilities, financing capacity that the public sector was able to bring to the table. What's incredible is that partnership was recognized just last month by the World Economic Forum as an example of public-private partnerships in urban transformation, and awarded as a model for cities around the world and countries to follow in terms of how the public sector and the private sector can work together hand in hand with community to initiate housing renewal and urban transformation.
Right. So I'm hearing a lot about including the neighborhood and sort of this inclusive approach to it, some different financing mechanisms. Some residents would say that the culture of the neighborhoods has completely changed. Maybe they still have units, but they see people driving into their towers and there's a lack of social mix. Others have been displaced. Others complain about the fact that the number of units built isn't meeting demand. And I just want to hear the perspectives on developers for this.
Do you want to?
Yeah, happy to get started on that one. So of course, there are absolutely challenges. Yes, Regent Park has awards recognized internationally. That is not to paint a rosy picture. There are significant challenges. There have been all along the way. Part of that is the time frame. If you look at our initial plans, which Bryan and I have, we've worked together for 13 years now. It was projected that the entire revitalization, 5 phases, 69 acres, would be complete in 15 to 20 years. We Daniels are in year 17 of working on Regent Park, and the 3rd phase is not even complete. So in terms of those expectations, that takes a lot of time to frankly disrupt lives. And with those time frames, with political changes, with economic changes, come uncertainty. And that is very, very challenging for residents. And while the right of return is a hallmark of the revitalization and something to be celebrated, it's enormously challenging, asking folks, and families, some of the city's most vulnerable, to leave their homes for an unidentified period of time and trust that this document that they were getting would allow them the right to come back to a neighborhood, frankly, that they may not recognize. And so what's really been critical for us is investing, as Bryan noted, in that social infrastructure, in elements of the community that would bring people together regardless of social, socioeconomic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, age, things like food and urban agriculture, arts and culture, sports and wellness, and then investing in a community governance structure and helping to build that capacity in the neighborhood.
I think it's a very important part of thinking differently about community and community building. And to Heela's point, there are a lot of opportunities for community benefits but there are residents who are going to feel left out. There are residents who are going to feel like they weren't included as a part of the planning and the programming. I think one thing that we have implemented in Alexandra Park, or what was implemented in Alexandra Park during the actual planning for revitalization, was intense consultation. And it happened in Regent Park as well prior to, as Bob mentioned, prior to any shovel hitting the ground. Residents were involved in deciding what the revitalization could and should look like. And in Alex Park specifically, there was a vote to do a partial revitalization where a few buildings were demolished and replaced, or just a repair of the community centers, which is what originally started the revitalization conversation, or a full revitalization, and a bit of an understanding of what that meant for disruption in the lives of residents. And the community chose to do a full revitalization and had some sense of what that would look like. Now, similar to Regent Park, the construction timelines are unpredictable. Relocation timelines are challenging also. One of my roles was working for Toronto Community Housing in the development department and assisting people with the relocation. And it was one of the most challenging things I've ever had to do. I realized that moving is one of people's greatest fears. And when you're being forced to move, it's compacted, it's compounded, and it's really stressful. But there are a lot of brave residents who were able to see a greater vision for not just for themselves, but for their children and their families. And I think that also speaks to the fact that this is no longer just transitional housing, it's generational housing. And they were able to push through and make a decision to go through the hard time in order to come out on the other end with a new community that has more than just bricks and mortar, but places for their kids to play and feel safe and engage with their community.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Now, I want to zoom out on our conversation a bit and bring Armine into this conversation. Armine, I'm curious what you can tell us about sort of the broader macroeconomic context and what we need to understand in order to place the Regent Park project and broader issues of housing affordability in Canada.
I guess my number one issue would be that we don't have enough affordable housing, and I don't even know how we're talking about affordability here. People have been seeing rather rapid rent increases throughout the city. We added over 1 million people just last year. We're not building at the pace we were, half a century ago with much less population growth, even though the federal government has quintupled the amount of money it is putting forward. A chunk of that went into repairing the stuff that was built a long time ago. So, both Heela and Bryan have been talking about the financial issues and Bob also, we're talking about the financial issues related to not repairing what we've got and needing to keep the stock. The whole issue of just preserving what we've got in terms of affordability is a huge issue right now. And I think it was Heela that said, 10 minutes one side, 10 minutes the other, location. Regent Park's a terrific place. And that has meant that because it's mixed income, people have been able to invest in that higher income parts of the units and then convert them to short-term rentals for things like the movie industry. And so how you hang on to affordable housing, how you make communities truly communities. Such great points have been raised already by your two speakers that, roll up your sleeves and do it every day. But the big issue right now is the squeeze that's coming from every direction, from newcomers, from homeowners that might lose their housing because of increases in interest rates by a central bank, by all central banks that are trying to fight inflation by raising rates, and by people that thought they were going to get into the housing market to own something that end up still being in the rental market, but have cash on hand. They have the down payments that they thought they could buy a house with. So there's so much competition coming from every direction that, the affordability question is disastrous in a city like Toronto. We are facing a crisis right now. The one thing I'd like to add to this is I'd like to build on what Heela was talking about with respect to things like community benefit agreements, that no matter what you build and where you build it, you can make every job a good job in those communities. You can actually build capacity, skills, and great jobs if you have pipelines in the community, and those things don't fall off a turnip truck. You need to develop relationships, and companies like Daniels and Tridel have been able to do that because of these public investments that needed to be revitalized, and you can carry that into other communities. You've now got a template on how to build relationships, and there is nothing like building a community when you build housing. It's remarkable.
Armine, following up, you were talking about housing affordability and that we haven't defined it yet. I was wondering if you could speak a bit about your definition of housing affordability and what it might take to attain that in Canada's housing system.
We are never going to have enough affordable housing if we don't subsidize construction more with taxpayer dollars. Canada is, I think, near the bottom of the spectrum of housing that is nonprofit, that is purpose-built to be nonprofit, community-based or nonprofit, whether those cooperatives or the type of developments we are talking about. And we are losing more units than we are building right now because so many people that over leveraged in the era of cheap money have realized that they can make more money on short-term rentals platforms than they can by having long-term rental. So we're actually taking more affordable product off the market than we are building at this pace. But what I mean by affordable is that you're not spending more than 50% of your income on just putting a roof over your head. And just to bring it back to some of the comments you made, Drew, right off the top, the average one-bedroom apartment in the town that you guys are sitting in is now $2,600 a month, one bedroom, for a vacant one-bedroom unit. Do you know how much you have to make to be able to put that roof over your head pre-tax? $84,000. Do you know how many people make that in Canada? 15% of the population files taxes with over $84,000. So, like, we're talking about unaffordability right there. What will it take to get there? Build, baby, build. I'm going to channel Sarah Palin here, but what we need to do is actually dig deeper into our pockets. As I mentioned earlier, the feds are spending 5 times as much as they were when they first came to power. A whole bunch of that went to just repair the stuff that was built in my parents' generation and Bob and Laura's parents' generation half a century ago. Yes, we are building new units, but something like 6,000 housing starts, rental unit starts in Toronto, when the projected need is 300,000 over the next decade. We're just not building enough. So we can't get there with the market. The math does not work for the market. The market is looking at 4 times the construction costs from pre-pandemic. And it's just like, it is impossible to build affordable housing if you're relying on the market. The government just has to step up. Good luck with that, because we're now in this whole, we're going to be fiscally responsible phase of the game.
So there's one point I want to build on from that, and that is rising interest rates right now. Regent Park was constructed at a period of time where rates were much lower. Bryan and Heela, thinking through the current interest rate environment, can you talk about how realistic and sort of the challenges facing these projects today, now that we're seeing developers halt work at different sites in Toronto?
Bryan, if it's okay with you, I'll start, because I want to set the context of where we were when Regent Park actually started, which was, or the first market housing in Regent Park started. So an important piece that we haven't gotten into, but sort of the creativity and the innovation that can come in these partnerships. When Daniels first responded to the request for proposals issued by Toronto Community Housing, they were looking for a development partner for phase 1. It was, a very standard, very prescriptive proposal of, we're looking for a partner to buy blocks of market housing and then tell us how much you charge to build the rental replacement. And I wasn't there at the time, but the team at Daniels looked at this and said, for something of this scale to work, there's never been ownership housing sold in Regent Park. The community is highly stigmatized, and not to mention the existing slum housing before Regent Park was constructed in the 40s and 50s had simply been demolished, and then the new housing built on top. So the environmental remediation that also had to happen was significant. It was very hard for us to value the land. And so we submitted what we called an alternative development framework, was that the public and private partners share both risk and reward, that the public sector actually put in the land into the partnership. We co-developed Toronto Community Housing and Daniels together, and then split the profits, with the lion's share going to Toronto Community Housing that also represented the value of the land that they were putting in. And we weren't selected as the developer. Toronto Community Housing, this is public knowledge, selected another developer, and within 3 months that fell apart. And Toronto Community Housing at that point resubmitted the same RFP document, except there was a new section called Alternative Development Frameworks, exactly what we had called our proposal. So that was our opening. And the joke at Daniels is we resubmitted with a new cover page saying the same thing we believed 3 months ago is still true today, and the rest of the proposal was the same, and this time we were selected. And so great. The partnership is off to a good start. The land goes in, really creative financing that the city actually, Toronto Community Housing actually provided the financing to build the first condominiums in phase 1. And the premise at the time was we have to actually build first before we go on sale. We have to demonstrate to the existing community and to folks that are going to buy condominiums that this change is real, that it's happening, that this will be a secure investment. And so we started building in 2006, getting ready, building a long registration list to go on sale early in 2009. And most folks will know what happened in October 2008. Where the market crashed, starting a recession. And the headlines at that time were, Regent Park revitalization fails before it even begins. It will take a miracle for the Regent Park revitalization to work. And so at the time, it wasn't much different than the headlines we're facing today around the miracles it would take to really find our way out of this housing crisis. I will say it probably will take a bigger miracle than it did in 2009, because at that time we were able to get creative, Drew. We were able to offer 5% down payments because of the creative financing that Toronto Community Housing had put in place. We were able to offer those down payments to be paid $1,000 a month till folks reached occupancy. And again, that was because of the financing that the public sector brought. So to Armine's point, we're not going to find our way out of this crisis without the public sector and government stepping in. I think if we reflect back, part of why we're in this crisis is that the governments have been missing from the housing game for so long, and it really relied on, private owners of condominiums and the absentee landlords that Bob referenced to step in. The math no longer cuts on that with the interest rates. It doesn't work for the private owners and landlords. It doesn't actually work for developers. Our rental projects, even with the HST now being removed, still do not pencil very well, and neither do condominiums. So there needs to be a larger movement at play here, just like Armine described.
And we saw in the start of Regent Park, the government coming to the table, TCHC coming to the table and financing projects. That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen anymore. And that was a very unique situation, but it was needed to create the momentum for the future phases to not be financed directly by the city. In terms of what we're seeing now in the marketplace, and the instability with interest rates increases, is that developers are holding off on projects or waiting to see some stability in the marketplace. And the impact that that has on this model of social housing is that it's built by the investors that agree that they want to be a part of this revitalization. So the private purchasers who come into Regent Park and other communities and say, I'm going to put down my cash in hopes that this community is going to work. We need them to be at the table, but they're not going to be at the table if interest rates are up and down and all over the place, because there's just too much risk. One thing a lesson that I learned from Regent Park as well is that, one, the city needs to lead and come to the table and decide that social housing is something that's worth investing in, and not just through the profits of the developer, but through all of us collectively, because we all collectively benefit when people have a place to live and work. But two, it's absolutely important for us to see housing as not just an investment opportunity, but it's a commodity that's needed by all. And if we can't depend on private companies to build that stable force or infrastructure for us, we as a community need to decide that it's important for all of us. And I think we're in a space right now in the city of Toronto, and in the province and federally, where there is that alignment and an understanding that we need to build more affordable housing. So we're in a very unique place, similar to what happened in Regent Park 15 years ago, where there was an understanding that this project needs to work. And I think that's true right now of affordable housing. We have to build affordable housing, and regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, there's an agreement with that. And I think after yesterday's announcements about the New Deal between the province and the city, and I think the letter that we received from the federal government, we're there. And maybe it's not a miracle, but there's a feeling that there's a desire for us to collectively start building, and for the government to put its kind of money where its mouth is in terms of supporting the process.
This is interesting to hear. In my own area, when we look at the history of when affordable housing was built in Canada, is through government intervention. And so there's the platitude that the market does not build affordable housing. It cannot. And that seems to be a message that's coming through here, and that there needs to be government involvement. And here, Armine, I want to bring you back into the conversation to talk about the federal government's re-engagement in housing, and what possibilities are there.
Oh man, there's so much possibility. I mean, I love listening to both Bryan and Heela, because it's an acknowledgement that governments don't build, developers build. But you need to have the imagination for how to build. Heela's story about what happened in Regent Park is really an important cautionary tale, that just because you haven't seen it happen yet doesn't mean it can't happen. And we need a couple of different things. We need absolutely measures to prevent the loss of existing affordable housing. Later on tonight, on the CBC, on the National, I every once in a while do a thing where I provide the macro context to people talking about an issue that is really kind of burning them. And the one tonight is on immigration and housing. Should we be bringing fewer people into the country because there's not enough housing? Really a tough conversation, and I encourage you, if you have any time or desire in the evening, to tune in to what the upshot of it is. But just to say that we need more housing, and we needed more housing before we had labor shortages, but we also have labor shortages, so we need more people. So yes and yes, and the problem isn't going away anytime soon. And so we need to prevent the further erosion of affordable housing stock. There's things governments at every level can do for that. We need rent control. I'm sorry for the developers that are in the room, but we need rent control at the moment, because whether you lift it or not, I mean, just looking at the numbers on the proposals for rental units in a jurisdiction where rent controls were lifted, in 2018, and then they were put on again during the pandemic, then they were lifted again, is like we're not seeing a spike in building because the costs are so high. I think the phrase you used, Heela, was it does not pencil very well. Which I love. I love that phrase, and I'm stealing it, so you know.
It's yours.
But the idea that the math does not work will continue to not work without more federal spending. And so, where do we get the more money from when the concern? What we need is every party at the federal level, because that's the appropriate level to unleash the dragons, right? That's where the money's going to come from. It's the cheapest level for financing. The feds borrow cheaper than the provinces do. The provinces borrow cheaper than the city does, if you could borrow. And the city, you know, it's like Russian nesting dolls. The smaller the scale, the higher the cost in borrowing. So the cheapest place to borrow money for this project is federally. But you need every party saying the same thing. And right now we've got the biggest source of no is the conservatives at the federal level who don't want to see the federal government spend more. But you can't work your way out of this economic slowdown problem because you need to bring more people in because of demographics. And yet we already don't have enough. So borrow more, spend more, do more community benefit agreements, put in what they're doing with the accelerator funding is terrific. They should be like multiplying that many times over. But also do what you guys have been doing in the revitalization projects, because we do need mixed housing. We do need neighborhoods that provide not just the asset of a house or the roof over your head, but a place to live. So you need urban design, and governments don't do urban design, developers do. So you need more of these enterprises that are going into areas that are maybe, you know, single detached homes because the boomers are overhoused and at some point they're going to have to move someplace. It's the biggest cohort that will be moving in the next 15 to 20 years. Plan for it. Have some plans on how you are going to free up density. And we're starting to talk about it, but man, demographics is the slowest moving train on the planet. We have no plan for it, right? Like, and it's happening in a neighborhood near you anywhere there was a baby boom after the Second World War, which is virtually all the rich countries of the world, right? So, and other countries have managed to anticipate this better than we have. I don't know what our desire is to make the market do everything, but it's not going to work, especially in Ontario.
Thank you. Now, before we go to question period, I want to give Bryan and Heela a chance for some final thoughts from this conversation, maybe thinking about relationships with government, relationships with the City of Toronto. We have Housing Toronto right now pushing to build 65,000 units. Your thoughts on how developers can contribute to that? And any other thoughts to bring the conversation to a close?
Yeah, sure. I think Armine's point has been great in the fact that what a lot of what Heela and I do is repairing existing stock. A lesson learned from Regent Park and Alex Park and the other revitalizations is that it's not a way to scale affordable housing. It's a way to repair the existing stock without dipping too much into the capital budgets or the operating budgets from the city. If we do want to build more affordable housing, I think it really comes down to very simply something that Heela talked about earlier: relationships and partnerships. I think it's very important to have relationships with all levels of government and the development industry. I mean, whether the city is developing the housing themselves and partnering with the private sector to just do construction, or if we're participating in the development as well. It's really about having those types of relationships where we all have a common goal. And I think lately, that, like I said earlier, that goal has been shifting towards just getting down to building housing, where I think before there was some reservations on inviting developers to the table to participate in housing and what our role is. But now there's a very consistent message, at least from City Hall specifically, and I think also from Queen's Park, that we need to build housing, and we're going to be in the business of building housing. And we can't do that unless we all work together and focus on specifically what it takes to build housing.
Heela?
I'm going to take Bryan's all work together and put a phrase on it that I'm borrowing from our president and CEO at Daniels Mitchell Cohen. So no problem, Armine. I borrow phrases all the time, so you can borrow mine. And it's a whole of community approach. And that's really the method we've used at Regent Park, where yes, there's a role for a developer, a housing agency, for community, but for private corporations like the Royal Bank, who stepped up and opened the first bank branch and then hired locally 3 years before their branch was even open. Like Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, that funded the creation of the new athletic grounds in Regent Park, as well as operating funding for local groups to participate there. The number of foundations and corporations and not-for-profits that have had a hand in making Regent Park what it is today is well beyond anything Toronto Community Housing and Daniels could have achieved on our own. And that same type of whole of community approach is needed on housing. It's not just going to be the private sector and the government that are going to solve this. We need the not-for-profit sector. We actually do have a not-for-profit housing sector in Toronto. Their capacity has and in Ontario writ large, their capacity has traditionally been limited because the funding and the investment hasn't been there. Let's put it there. And to help put it there, there's also a role for philanthropy. Traditionally, philanthropy has focused on healthcare and education and arts, but not in housing, because that was seen as a private sort of market role as determined by the government. And so if philanthropy steps in and realizes that we may not need as many investments in healthcare and even education, if we give people a stable place to live, that's going to go a long way. What's the role of the banks and lenders in there? Because there is a significant one in how we might make home ownership more accessible. Each of the banks have ESG programs, environmental, social governance programs. They have sustainable finance frameworks. How about lending mortgage financing a little lower on projects that meet certain sustainability criteria or certain social impact criteria? This is going to take all of us to get creative and innovative and bring all of the tools we have to bear. And so that's what I'd like to see happen.
Great. And now, before we go to question period, maybe just a chance for final thoughts from Armine.
Oh, geez. I don't know that I have that much to add. I really like the idea of having the banks play a role, not just the taxpayer, in making ownership more accessible, but also the banks maybe playing a role in reverse mortgages. You guys probably don't watch TV, but my age group still watches TV, and there's lots of ads for the chip reverse mortgage. And if banks actually permitted that to happen, so you could marry a young family and rent to own, so that the older family could move and have a flow of income, and the young family could move in with less of a down payment, like move towards it. I just think there's all sorts of creative financing measures that might be partially subsidized by the federal government. But the big story here is not ownership. Frankly, the big story is renting. And we don't have enough places to rent. And, can I just, two things on this. We need to flip the script that we've been living with for the last 40 years. Number one, the script that I have lived with as an economist my entire life is more market, less government. We are at a moment where we need more government and a little bit less market, at least in this domain. And the second part is, do not be afraid of wage increases. We are not entering a wage price spiral. But if people cannot work where they live, if they have to commute further and further and spend more and more money on gas or transit time to be able to get to work, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. We're destroying communities and we're destroying lives. So we absolutely need to permit wages to go up so that people can afford to live closer to where they work, and we need to be investing in communities, not just in housing, not in assets, but in lifestyles. And that goes to the point that Heela was making about all, what did you say? Whole
The
of community approach. That's the Mitch Cohen line, which includes how you get your community benefit agreements into place. You can't do it without the nonprofit sector that knows who the people are, that need a hand up. It is a whole of community approach. And when you do it right, everybody feels better. Like, what's not to love?
Thank you. And with that, I want to turn it to question period. Perhaps we'll take 2 to 3 questions at a time. I'll ask that you speak into the microphone for it so that our online audience can hear. If you have a question, please raise your hand.
I have a question. Is this on? Okay. Thank you. Okay. Vis-a-vis the rental, the whole question about rental and short-term rentals, because that's a kind of postmodern invention, and it's eating up a lot of housing stock. What are the regulations? What's happening with regard to Airbnb and all that kind of stuff?
Any other questions before we go to the panelists?
Thank you so much for that great presentation. I've been able to find any stats, like specific stats on the numbers of rent geared to income households who have returned. And so I was just wondering if that information is publicly available and where I can find it.
And maybe one more question if there's one.
Thank you all. Can you speak to the distinction between housing as a commodity and housing as a right, and the implications for Tridel and Daniels if the norm was that most or all developments were nonprofit developments?
Thanks. Would anyone like to take a stab at one of those questions?
I can talk about short-term rentals if you want.
Great.
So Montreal is at the cutting edge of how to regulate and enforce. So it isn't just putting new rules in place, it's actually enforcing the rules that you've got. And that has proved to be extremely difficult because every time you design a new rule, somebody figures out how to game the rule. And there's a lot of incentive to game the rules right now because so many people overextended in the period of cheap money and over-leveraged themselves, and now they are at risk of losing their investment. That kind of goes to the commodity story, but this is what happens when you have an era of borrowing that we have never seen, not only in modern history, not in ancient history. You'd have to go back 5,000 years to see rates of borrowing at the levels we saw in the wake of the 2008-9 global financial crisis. And it happened everywhere. Housing bubbles happened everywhere, but boy, were we primed for it here in Toronto and Vancouver, less so in Montreal, where there was a larger renting population to begin with. And that's maybe why Montreal is so at the cutting edge. I really encourage you to take a look at how Montreal has evolved its regulatory structure for short-term rentals and shown what the penalties are and actually enforce the penalties. Toronto has been much shabbier. That may change under a new mayoral regime. And in the fall economic statement, there was $50 million provided by the federal government to help cities enforce their rules on short-term rentals. But the rules are not uniform, and nor does the federal government have the right to impose these rules. They will be municipally determined. And that's what short-term rental platforms are doing. They're gaming the system city by city by city because you're going to find a weak link somewhere. And that is hugely problematic. Where we could fix it is at the provincial level, where we could have the province impose rules, but we haven't seen any desire to do so. Surprise. And same in a fairly libertarian cabinet in Quebec. But you could do, because municipalities constitutionally are the children, the invention of the provinces, you could be putting in 13 jurisdictional sets of rules for the 10 provinces and 3 territories and do something. But these guys don't play nice together. The report card gets sent home a while back and they don't actually like playing with the feds. So we could, as citizens, pressure our province to do more. But even the city here, under a new mayor, we haven't heard boo about new rules. Mind you, it hasn't been that long, but that seems to me a very promising avenue to go, to get better rules, and not just rules, but enforcement of those rules. But that takes cash.
Great, thank you. And now maybe thinking about more information around the right to return, and also this question around the commodification of housing. Bryan and Heela, your thoughts?
I can start with the right of return. So you might have to dig a little bit, but if you go to Toronto Community Housing's website, they have a Regent Park page. And in that Regent Park page, they have a series of community updates. Typically, they're PDF presentations that go up. Pre-pandemic, they were happening pretty regularly, perhaps less so more recently. I can share that the last figure I've seen was around 76% was the return rate. And of the folks who hadn't returned, about 14 or so percent were still waiting to return. So because the right to return can actually be deferred when a family is offered, they don't have to accept. So a number of folks had deferred, and then the balance of that families had either stayed in their relocated homes elsewhere in the Toronto Community Housing portfolio, or they had moved out of Toronto Community Housing in general. But there might be more up-to-date information via Toronto Community Housing's website. On that housing question, the affordable housing and housing in general, beyond the economics of it, has been in the Daniels DNA since our company's inception, which will be 40 years next year. We really started as a builder of not-for-profit housing and co-op housing, and when all of the government programs were canceled, that's when we sort of converted to market housing. So in our developments today, even though we're not required to by zoning or statutory regulations, we do look to put some affordable housing opportunities in Regent Park. We did a purpose-built rental building with Sun Life Financial, BGO, the pension fund, and voluntarily did that building 10% affordable housing. In our other market development, we partner with groups like Habitat for Humanity GTA, or more recently, a group called L'Arche Toronto that does work with individuals with intellectual disabilities to make sure that in as many of our communities as possible, we're integrating opportunities for affordable housing.
And I know we're running short on time, but I would say to that question, so housing as a commodity versus as a right. I think the challenge is that housing is not just a commodity; it's an investment tool, and because it's an investment tool that is scarce, like horizontally, we can't build out any more into the lake. One of the other limits is vertically, and I think if we continue to scale how we build housing, all types of housing, affordable housing, rental housing, and condominiums, there's going to be an opportunity for builders to be a part of that solution. And I think the hope is, as we increase the amount of units that come to the marketplace, as we're growing as a society, that developers will have a role in building those homes, and that's what we do. So my concern with the question is, I think it can be a commodity and a right, but I think right now in Toronto and in a lot of growing nations, it's an investment tool, and I think that's how we have to think about housing a little bit differently.
Now, as we come to the end of our panel, I like to end with a bit of a provocation. So many individuals affected by housing affordability have long recognized it as a persistent issue. It's interesting to note that it's really gained widespread attention now that it's starting to impact middle income groups. And that brings me to a quote from an author whose birthday it is today. The thing is that this person is 202 years old, and this book was written in 1872. And as a little catch, if you can tell me who wrote this quote, once we're done, I'll buy you a drink at the bar. The author writes, "The growth of big modern cities gives the land in certain areas particularly those which are central and artificial and colossally increasing value. The existing buildings in these areas depress this value because they no longer correspond to the changing circumstances. Buildings are pulled down and replaced by others. This takes place above all with workers' houses, which are situated centrally and whose rents can only very slowly increase. And so we see that even in 1872, this was an issue. And we see that housing affordability continues to be a feature of our economic system. And that brings us to the end. So I want to remind you all that we have a second panel on January 24th that's bringing together the perspectives of people in Regent Park and their experiences with this project. And I want to thank our panelists one last time for sharing their thoughts, to the organizers, and to you for attending. Please join me in thanking everyone.